July 28, 1965. Da Nang Air Base, Republic of Vietnam. The rear ramp of the C-130 drops and the heat hits like a wall. Not the dry heat of Southern California or the humid warmth of South Carolina summers. Something else entirely. Something thick. Something that smells like jet fuel and red dust and burning trash and the ocean all at once. Private First Class Michael Brennan, 19 years old, from a town in Pennsylvania with one stoplight and two churches, steps onto the tarmac with 83 other Marines. None of them speak. The propellers are still turning. The air shimmers. Somewhere in the distance, there's the dull thud of artillery. American artillery, they're told, outgoing, nothing to worry about. Brennan's pack weighs 60 pounds. His M14 rifle is spotless. His uniform is still pressed from the flight. He looks exactly like what he is. A kid fresh out of infantry training sent 9,000 miles from home to fight a war he barely understands. He was told this would be temporary. He was told the South Vietnamese needed help getting organized. He was told Americans were advisors, not combatants. He was told a lot of things. The Marine beside him, a lance corporal from Detroit named Rivers, leans over and mutters, "Welcome to the shit, boot." Brennan doesn't respond. He's staring at the tree line beyond the airstrip. It looks peaceful, green, almost beautiful. He wonders if the enemy is out there, watching. He wonders if they know he's afraid. He wonders if this is what courage is supposed to feel like, or if courage is just another word for not having a choice. A staff sergeant walks down the line, clipboard in hand, chewing gum like it's the only thing keeping him sane. Listen up. You will not wander off. You will not talk to civilians. You will not take pictures. You will not write home about what you see here until your letters are reviewed. You are United States Marines. Act like it. Brennan nods. He doesn't understand yet. None of them do. But they will. Because the truth about Vietnam, the truth that only Marines would come to understand, wasn't written in field manuals or spoken in briefings. It was learned in the mud, in the heat, in the silence after the firefight, in the eyes of men who'd seen too much and said too little. It was learned the hard way, and it would take a lifetime to unlearn. To understand what Vietnam became, you have to remember what it was supposed to be. In 1961, when John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and spoke of bearing any burden and paying any price, the war in Southeast Asia wasn't yet a war. It was a mission, a noble effort, a test of American resolve in the global struggle against communism. The dominoes were falling: China in 1949, North Korea in 1950, Cuba in 1959, and Vietnam was next. Kennedy sent advisors, not combat troops, advisors, men who would train the South Vietnamese army, help them organize, help them resist the encroachment of the Viet Cong in the north. It was supposed to be clean, surgical, limited. But by 1965, the advisors weren't enough. The South Vietnamese government was collapsing. The Viet Cong controlled the countryside. And so, in March of that year, the 1st Marine Combat Units landed at Da Nang, not to advise, but to fight. The young men who enlisted in those years didn't do it because they'd studied Cold War policy or read about the Gulf of Tonkin. Most of them had never heard of Vietnam until the recruiter told them it was where they'd be going. They enlisted for the same reasons young men have always enlisted: to prove themselves, to escape small towns with no future, to become part of something larger than themselves. In the summer of 1964, in diners and drive-ins across Middle America, boys barely out of high school sat across from Marine recruiters in dress blues and listened to the pitch. The uniform was immaculate. The posture was perfect. The message was simple. The Marine Corps makes men. And they believed it. They believed it because their fathers had fought in World War II in Korea and came home heroes. They believed it because the movies told them war was hell, but also glorious. They believed it because the alternative, staying in Akron or Omaha or Little Rock, working at the factory or the gas station, marrying the girl next door and wondering what else was out there, felt like dying slow. So they signed. And they went to Paris Island or Camp Pendleton, where drill instructors stripped them down and rebuilt them. They learned to march in step, fire in unison, kill on command. They learned the rifleman's creed. This is my rifle. There are many like it, but this one is mine. They learned that being a Marine wasn't a job. It was an identity, a brotherhood, a code. And in early 1965, when President Lyndon Johnson authorized Operation Rolling Thunder and committed American ground forces to Vietnam, those young Marines believed they were going to win. Quickly, decisively, the way Americans always won. They didn't know yet that this war would be different. They didn't know that there would be no front lines, no clear objectives, no enemy uniforms to distinguish friend from foe. They didn't know that victories would be measured in body counts, not territory gained. They didn't know that the mission would change every 6 months, that the rules of engagement would shift like sand, that they'd be told to take a hill one week and abandon it the next. They didn't know that back home, while they were loading onto planes and ships bound for Da Nang and Chu Lai and Khe Sanh, the country was already beginning to fracture. In 1965, the protests were small, fringe, mostly college students on the coasts. But they were growing. The teach-ins at Berkeley, the draft card burnings, the signs that read, "Hell no, we won't go." The rising voices of a generation that questioned authority, rejected tradition, and saw the war not as a noble struggle but as imperialism dressed in olive drab. The Marines didn't care about the protests. Not yet. They had each other. They had a mission. They had the pride that came from wearing the eagle, globe, and anchor. But even then, even in those early days when optimism still outweighed doubt, there were signs. Small fractures. A captain in Quantico who'd served as an advisor in 1963 and came back shaking his head, saying the South Vietnamese didn't want to fight their own war. A staff sergeant who muttered that the enemy knew the jungle better than any American ever would. A chaplain who prayed a little harder before each deployment, as if he knew what was coming. The promise of Vietnam was simple. Go, fight, win, come home. But war has a way of breaking promises. And by the time the Marines understood that, by the time they realized the war couldn't be won the way they'd been trained to win it, it was too late. They were already there. Nothing prepared them for the heat. Not the summers in Texas or Georgia or Southern California. Not the humidity of Paris Island in August. Nothing. Vietnam was a heat that soaked through your uniform before you'd been on the ground 10 minutes. It turned your pack into a furnace strapped to your back. It made your rifle too hot to hold without gloves. It turned water in your canteen lukewarm within an hour, and by noon it tasted like metal and iodine tablets in desperation. And that was just the beginning. The Marine Corps had trained them for combat, marksmanship, fire and maneuver, land navigation, close quarters battle. They could field strip an M14 blindfolded. They could dig a fighting hole in 20 minutes. They could march 20 miles with full gear and still be ready to fight. But no amount of training prepared them for the reality of Vietnam. The villages didn't look like the ones in the briefings. In the briefings, there were clear indicators: VC flags, weapons caches, hostile civilians. In reality, the villages were full of women and children and old men who smiled and waved during the day and disappeared at night. The rice paddies looked peaceful until you realized they were laced with punji stakes, sharpened bamboo smeared with excrement, hidden just below the waterline, waiting to puncture a boot and infect the wound. The jungle wasn't a jungle. It was a maze. Triple canopy forest so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. Vines that grabbed at your arms, leeches that latched onto your skin, mosquitoes the size of flies, snakes that dropped from trees, and everywhere the silence. Except it wasn't really silent. It was full of sounds you couldn't identify. Rustling, clicking, voices in a language you didn't understand, echoing from somewhere you couldn't pinpoint. The Marines learned quickly. The enemy didn't fight the way they'd been taught to fight. There were no massed formations, no pitched battles where you could see the whites of their eyes. The Viet Cong attacked at night from tunnels and tree lines, then melted away before you could respond. They planted mines on trails you'd walked safely the day before. They set booby traps with grenades and tripwires and artillery shells rigged to detonate when you opened a door, or lifted a pot, or stepped on the wrong patch of dirt. And the worst part, The part that gnawed at every Marine who spent more than a month in country was that you couldn't tell who the enemy was. The boy who sold you Coca-Cola at the base perimeter might be VC. The woman who did laundry for the officers might be reporting troop movements. The village elder who smiled and accepted your cigarettes might be stockpiling weapons in a tunnel beneath his home. Trust became impossible. Paranoia became survival. In the briefings, they'd been told the South Vietnamese were allies, partners, people who wanted freedom and were willing to fight for it. In reality, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN, was poorly trained, poorly led, and riddled with corruption. Some units fought hard, most didn't. Marines watched ARVN soldiers retreat under fire, abandon their posts, sell American supplies on the black market. It didn't take long for resentment to build. Why are we dying for people who won't fight for themselves? But orders were orders, and Marines followed orders. So they patrolled, day after day, week after week, through rice paddies and villages and jungles that all looked the same. They searched hooches for weapons. They called in airstrikes on suspected VC positions. They walked point on trails where every step might be their last. They wrote letters home and said everything was fine because what else could they say? The Marine Corps had taught them to be disciplined, to be tough, to adapt and overcome. And they did. They adapted to the heat and the rain and the snakes and the insects. They adapted to the fear that never went away, the constant low-grade terror that lived in your chest and woke you up at night. They adapted to watching friends die, not in glorious charges, but stepping on mines or taking sniper fire from a tree line they'd cleared an hour before, or getting hit by mortars while eating chow. They adapted because they had no choice. But adaptation isn't the same as acceptance. And deep down, in places they didn't talk about, not with each other, not in letters, not even in their own heads, a question began to form. What are we doing here? It was a dangerous question, the kind of question that could break you if you thought about it too long. So they didn't think about it. They focused on the mission, on staying alive, on getting their brothers home. Because if there was one truth every Marine learned in Vietnam, it was this: you don't fight for flags or politicians or abstract ideas about freedom. You fight for the man next to you, and you pray that's enough. November 12, 1967. Firebase Bastogne, near the DMZ. Lance Corporal Thomas Eugene Hartley, 20 years old, sits on an empty ammo crate outside his bunker and tries to write a letter. The paper is damp from the humidity. The pen keeps skipping. His hands are shaking, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He hasn't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 2 weeks. He's been in country for 7 months. He has 5 months left on his tour. 5 months feels like forever. The letter is to his mother, Rose Hartley, a schoolteacher in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She writes him every week, long letters full of news about neighbors and weather and church socials, letters that smell like her perfume and make him homesick in a way he can't explain. He's supposed to write back. All the Marines do. It's part of the unspoken contract. You go to war, you stay in touch, you let your family know you're okay. But how do you tell your mother the truth when the truth is unspeakable? He starts the letter the way he always does. Dear Mom, I hope this letter finds you well. Things are fine here. The weather is hot, but we're getting used to it. The food isn't great, but it's better than sea rations. Don't worry about me. I'm staying safe. It's a lie. All of it. The weather isn't just hot. It's unbearable. The monsoon rains turn the base into a swamp. The mud is knee-deep. The bunkers flood. Everything rots. Clothes. Boots. Skin. You can't get dry. You can't get clean. Fungus grows on your feet, your hands, between your fingers. Infections that won't heal. Sores that ooze and stink. The food isn't better than sea rations. It's worse. When the supply helicopters can't land because of the weather, they eat whatever they have left. Crackers, peanut butter, instant coffee. Sometimes nothing at all. And safe? Nobody's safe. 2 days ago, a mortar round landed 15 feet from where he's sitting now. It killed a corporal from Tennessee, a kid named Walker who'd been in country 3 weeks. Hartley helped carry what was left of him to the medevac chopper. But he doesn't write that. He can't. Instead, he writes about the Marines in his squad. About Rodriguez, who's from Los Angeles and tells jokes that aren't funny but make everyone laugh anyway. About Jenkins, who's from Alabama and plays harmonica at night when it's quiet. About Sergeant Kowalski, who's on his second tour and has a wife and 2 daughters back in Pennsylvania, and never talks about them because talking makes it worse. He writes about the monsoon, but only to say it rains a lot. He doesn't mention the way the rain pounds the sandbags so hard you can't hear yourself think. He doesn't mention the rats that come out when it floods, or the way the mud smells like death. He writes, "We've been busy, patrols mostly, nothing too dangerous." What he means is, we walk through the jungle every day waiting to get shot. We step over trails we know are mined because we have no choice. We burn villages because we're told they're VC. We watch civilians scatter and wonder if they'll come back at night with rifles. He pauses, stares at the paper, tries to find words that won't make her worry and won't make him a liar. I think about home a lot. I think about the farm and the creek behind the house and sitting on the porch in the summer. I think about your cooking. I think about the way fall smells in Iowa, like wood smoke and apples and dry leaves. I miss it. I miss you. That part is true. The truest thing he's written. He wants to tell her that he's afraid. That he doesn't sleep anymore. Not really, because every time he closes his eyes he sees Walker's body. That he's not the same person who left Cedar Rapids in March. That he doesn't know if he'll ever be that person again. He wants to tell her that the war doesn't make sense. That they take hills and lose men and abandon the hills a week later. That the enemy is everywhere and nowhere. That the South Vietnamese don't seem to care whether they win or lose. That he's starting to wonder if anyone back home even remembers there's a war happening. But he doesn't write any of that. Instead, he writes, "I'll be home soon. Tell Dad I said hello. Tell Sarah I'm proud of her for making the honor roll. Tell everyone I'm doing fine. Love, Tommy." He folds the letter, seals it, hands it to the mail clerk, and then he sits on the ammo crate and stares at the jungle and wonders if his mother will ever know the truth. The truth that only Marines understand. The truth that can't be written in letters. While the Marines fought in the jungles of Vietnam, America was tearing itself apart. In the summer of 1967, the summer of love, 100,000 young people descended on San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. They wore flowers in their hair. They spoke of peace and unity and consciousness expansion. They listened to Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead. They rejected materialism, rejected authority, rejected the values of their parents' generation, and they rejected the war. The anti-war movement, which had started as a fringe protest on college campuses, was growing. Teach-ins became marches. Marches became riots. In October 1967, 50,000 demonstrators surrounded the Pentagon. They carried signs that read, "Bring the troops home," and "Hell no, we won't go." They chanted, they burned draft cards. Some tried to levitate the building through collective meditation. It would have been funny if it weren't so painful, because while they protested, Marines were dying. 200 Americans killed every week, 800 wounded, numbers that scrolled across television screens every evening, delivered in Walter Cronkite's measured baritone, as families across the country ate dinner and tried not to imagine their sons in body bags. Vietnam was the first televised war, the first war Americans watched in their living rooms. Footage of firefights, burning villages, wounded soldiers screaming for medics, helicopter evacuations, body counts. It was raw, unfiltered, and it was in color. The images were supposed to rally support, to show the American people what their troops were up against, to make the enemy real. Instead, they turned the country against the war. Because what people saw wasn't a noble struggle against communism. It wasn't heroes liberating the oppressed. It was chaos, confusion. Young men fighting and dying in a jungle that looked nothing like the battlefields of World War II. Soldiers setting fire to thatched huts with Zippo lighters. Officers giving interviews and saying, "We had to destroy the village in order to save it." It didn't make sense. And the more people watched, the less sense it made. By 1967, The country was fracturing along generational lines. The parents who'd fought in World War II couldn't understand why their children opposed this war. The children couldn't understand why their parents supported it. Arguments erupted at dinner tables. Families stopped speaking. Sons left for Canada rather than report for induction. The draft turned the war into a class issue. The rich could get deferments, college deferments, medical deferments, family hardship deferments. The poor couldn't. Working-class kids from small towns and inner cities filled the ranks of the infantry. They were the ones who went to Vietnam. They were the ones who came home in caskets or wheelchairs or not at all. And they were the ones the protesters called baby killers. The Marines knew what was happening back home. They read letters. They heard stories from guys rotating back to the States. They knew about the protests, the marches, the rhetoric. They knew Jane Fonda was sitting on a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gun, smiling for the cameras. They knew Muhammad Ali had refused induction, saying, "No Viet Cong ever called me nigger." It hurt. Deeper than they admitted. Deeper than they could articulate. Because the Marines hadn't wanted this war any more than the protesters. They hadn't chosen Vietnam. They'd been sent, and they were doing what their country had asked them to do. What their fathers and grandfathers had done in wars before. But this time, the country didn't want them. The culture that had once glorified soldiers now vilified them. Movies and music and television turned against the war. Folk singers wrote protest anthems. Playwrights wrote anti-war dramas. Journalists wrote exposés about atrocities and cover-ups and the lies the Pentagon told. And slowly, inexorably, the narrative shifted. The war wasn't just wrong. The men fighting it were complicit. They were tools of imperialism, agents of murder. Or at best, they were victims. Poor, uneducated, brainwashed pawns who didn't know better. The Marines didn't see themselves that way. They saw themselves as professionals, as warriors, as men doing a hard job in an impossible situation. But no one wanted to hear it. Back home, the divide deepened. Hawks versus doves, patriots versus traitors, silent majority versus the counterculture. There was no middle ground. You either supported the war or you didn't. You either backed the troops or you betrayed them. And in that binary, the Marines became symbols. Not people, not sons or brothers or husbands. Symbols. For the right, they were heroes defending freedom. For the left, they were villains perpetuating atrocity. But the truth was neither. The truth was more complicated, more human. The truth was they were just trying to survive. And while America argued about the war, the Marines kept fighting it, not because they believed in it anymore, but because they believed in each other. Because when your country abandons you, all you have left is your brothers. January 30th, 1968. The beginning of Tet, the Vietnamese New Year. For weeks, there had been a ceasefire, a temporary peace to honor the holiday. The South Vietnamese celebrated. The Americans relaxed. Intelligence reported that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were repositioning, but nothing suggested what was coming. And then, all at once, the war exploded. 80,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops launched coordinated attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. Saigon, Da Nang, Hue, Quang Tri, Can Tho, simultaneously, without warning. The U.S. Embassy in Saigon was breached. VC sappers blew a hole in the wall and fought their way into the compound. For 6 hours, they held parts of the embassy grounds while Marine guards fought them room by room. The images, broadcast live on American television, were catastrophic. The embassy, the symbol of American power in Vietnam, under attack. But the real battle was in Hue. The ancient imperial city, a cultural and spiritual center, fell to the North Vietnamese on the first day of the offensive. 10,000 NVA troops stormed the citadel, raised the flag of the National Liberation Front, and dug in. They executed South Vietnamese officials, police officers, teachers, anyone suspected of collaborating with the Americans. Thousands were shot or buried alive. Mass graves filled the outskirts of the city. The Marines were ordered to take it back. For 26 days, they fought street by street, house by house, room by room. Urban combat. The kind of fighting the Marine Corps hadn't done since the Pacific in World War II. No air support. The city was too populated. No artillery. The risk of civilian casualties was too high. Just rifles and grenades and flamethrowers and the brutal, exhausting work of clearing a city held by an enemy that refused to surrender. The NVA fought from fortified positions, bunkers, spider holes. The walls of the citadel itself, 5 meters thick, built centuries ago to withstand siege. The Marines advanced by yards, sometimes by feet. They took casualties every day. Sniper fire, booby traps, ambushes from buildings they'd already cleared. The weather turned, monsoon rains. The streets became rivers. Visibility dropped to nothing. Helicopters couldn't fly. Resupply convoys couldn't get through. The Marines ran low on ammunition, on food, on medical supplies. The wounded lay in makeshift aid stations, waiting for evacuation that might not come. And still, they fought. A 19-year-old private from Ohio named Marvin carried a wounded sergeant 3 blocks under fire, through a street swept by machine guns, and brought him to cover. He was hit twice. He kept moving. A lance corporal from New York named DeMarco held a stairwell for 4 hours while his squad evacuated civilians from the upper floors of a building. When the NVA finally overran his position, they found him dead, surrounded by shell casings and enemy bodies. A corpsman from Minnesota named Peterson treated 70 wounded Marines over 3 days without sleep, without rest, working in a bombed-out school while mortar rounds fell around him. On the 4th day, he was killed by sniper fire while crossing the street to reach a Marine who was bleeding out. These weren't the stories that made the news. The news showed the citadel in flames, the rubble, the exhausted faces of Marines stumbling through smoke, the flag of the National Liberation Front flying over the city. The news showed chaos, defeat, the collapse of the American war effort. But the Marines didn't see it that way. They saw a hard fight, a brutal fight, but a fight they were winning. By the end of February, Hue was retaken. The NVA was driven out. The city was in ruins, but it was back in American and South Vietnamese hands. The Tet Offensive, as a military operation, was a disaster for the North Vietnamese. They suffered staggering casualties, 50,000 dead, entire battalions wiped out. The Viet Cong infrastructure in the South was shattered. It should have been a victory. But back home, it didn't feel like one. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, returned from Vietnam and delivered his verdict on the evening news. It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. President Johnson, watching from the White House, reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." And he had. Tet was the turning point. Not because the Americans lost. They didn't. But because it shattered the illusion that the war was winnable, that the enemy was on the verge of collapse, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. The Marines in Hue didn't know it yet, but they'd won a battle and lost the war. Because wars aren't won on battlefields alone. They're won in the hearts of the people back home. And after Tet, America's heart wasn't in it anymore. There were things the Marines learned in Vietnam that no manual ever taught. Things that couldn't be explained in training. Things that only made sense when you were there, living it, breathing it, surviving it. These were the unspoken rules. Rule 1. Trust no one but your brothers. The enemy didn't wear uniforms. The farmer working his rice paddy might be VC. The woman selling noodles at the market might be spotting for mortars. The child offering to shine your boots might be carrying a grenade. Trust the villagers and you might die. Trust the ARVN and you'd be disappointed. Trust the officers and you'd be sent on patrols that made no sense. But trust the Marine next to you. The one who'd carried your pack when you couldn't, who'd stood watch so you could sleep, who'd shared his last cigarette and his last can of peaches, and you had a chance. So the Marines learned to keep their circles small. Squads, fire teams, the guys you ate with, fought with, bled with. Everyone else was peripheral. Rule 2. Fear is constant. Courage is managing it. There was no such thing as fearlessness in Vietnam. Anyone who claimed otherwise was lying or insane. Fear lived in your chest every moment of every day. Fear of stepping on a mine, fear of sniper fire, fear of booby traps, fear of dying slow, gut shot, screaming for a corpsman who couldn't reach you. But courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing the job anyway. Walking point even though point men didn't last long. Running into fire to pull a wounded Marine to safety. Staying calm when the mortars came in. Doing what needed to be done because someone had to do it. The Marines didn't talk about courage. Talking about it cheapened it. They just did it, and hoped it was enough. Rule 3. The mission doesn't always make sense. Do it anyway. They took hills and lost men taking them, then abandoned the hills a week later. They patrolled the same villages over and over, searching for weapons they never found. They called in airstrikes on tree lines that might or might not have held enemy fighters. They burned hooches because someone said there was a VC cache inside, even when there wasn't. The strategy, if there was one, was attrition. Kill more of them than they kill of us. Win by the numbers. But in a war where the enemy could blend into the population, where borders meant nothing, where reinforcements came down the Ho Chi Minh Trail faster than you could kill them, attrition didn't work. The Marines knew it. But orders were orders, so they followed them. Rule 4. The moral lines blur. War is supposed to have rules. Good guys and bad guys. Right and wrong. But in Vietnam, the lines blurred fast. You were told to win hearts and minds, then told to burn the village. You were told to protect civilians, then told to call in artillery on a hamlet because it might be VC. You handed out candy to children in the morning and shot at shadows in the rice paddies at night, never knowing if the shadows were insurgents or farmers. You made choices. Hard choices. Impossible choices. Do you fire on a woman running toward your checkpoint when she won't stop even though she might be carrying a bomb? Do you shoot the kid on the bicycle because he's pedaling too fast toward your convoy? Do you clear the tunnel with grenades first, knowing there might be civilians inside? Some Marines carried the weight of those choices for the rest of their lives. Some buried it deep and never spoke of it. Some broke. Rule 5. Survival trumps everything. At some point, for most Marines, the mission stopped being about winning the war. It became about getting home, about keeping your brothers alive, about making it through your tour. 365 days, counted down meticulously, obsessively, one by one. You stopped thinking about communism or democracy or the domino theory. You stopped caring about the politics. You started thinking in smaller terms. Get through today. Get through this patrol. Get through this firefight. And when your tour was done, when you finally boarded the Freedom Bird back to the States, you didn't feel victorious. You felt relieved. And guilty. Guilty that you'd made it and others hadn't. Guilty that you were leaving your brothers behind. Guilty that you'd survived. Rule 6. No one back home will understand. You could talk about the heat and the rain and the boredom. You could talk about the food and the mail and the guys in your squad. You could tell funny stories and safe stories and stories that didn't require explaining what it felt like to kill someone or watch someone die. But the truth, the real truth, you couldn't talk about that. Not to your parents, not to your girlfriend, not to anyone who hadn't been there, because the truth about Vietnam was unspeakable, and only Marines understood. Coming home should have been the easy part. It wasn't. The Marines who survived their tours in Vietnam, the ones who made it through 365 days without being killed or crippled, boarded planes at Da Nang or Tan Son Nhut and flew east across the Pacific. Back to the world, they called it. Back to civilization. Back to America. The flight took 18 hours, sometimes more. Most of them didn't sleep. They sat in silence, still in their uniforms, still carrying the smell of Vietnam, sweat and mud and gunpowder and something else, something they couldn't wash off. They landed at military air bases. Travis in California, El Toro, Camp Pendleton, and the moment they stepped off the plane, they knew something was wrong. No crowds, no banners, no parades. In World War II, soldiers came home to ticker tape parades and kissing girls in Times Square. In Korea, they came home quietly, but they came home to respect. Vietnam was different. The Marines were told not to wear their uniforms off base, told to change into civilian clothes before leaving the terminal, told not to talk about their service, told to blend in, because outside the gates America didn't want to see them. In 1969, a Marine corporal named James returned to his hometown in Michigan. He'd been wounded twice, lost 3 fingers on his left hand, spent 4 months in a hospital in Okinawa before being discharged. He came home expecting to see his family, his friends, the girl he'd left behind. His family hugged him. His friends avoided him. The girl had moved on. At the local diner, where he'd eaten breakfast every Saturday morning before he enlisted, the waitress who used to know his name looked at him like he was a stranger. At the VFW hall where his father drank on Friday nights, the World War II veterans asked polite questions and changed the subject quickly. No one wanted to hear about Vietnam, because Vietnam wasn't a war you were supposed to be proud of. It was a war you were supposed to forget. In airports and bus stations across the country, Marines in uniform were spat on, called baby killers, called murderers. Protesters threw things, screamed at them, shoved anti-war pamphlets into their hands. It didn't matter that most of them had been drafted. Didn't matter that they'd followed orders. Didn't matter that they'd done what their country asked. They were the face of the war, and the war was hated. So they learned to keep quiet, to bury the memories, to pretend Vietnam never happened. They took off their uniforms and put them in closets and never wore them again. They threw away their medals. They avoided talking about their service. When people asked what they'd done in the late 60s, they said, "I was overseas," or "I was in the service," and left it at that. They got jobs, when they could. Factories, warehouses, construction. The GI Bill helped some go to college, but walking onto a campus in 1970 meant walking into hostile territory. Professors who mocked the military, students who wore Viet Cong flags as armbands, protests where signs read, "U.S. out of Vietnam," and "Stop the baby killers." Some Marines dropped out, went back to blue-collar work, kept their heads down. Others struggled in ways that had no name yet. They couldn't sleep. They woke up screaming. They heard helicopters that weren't there. They saw faces in crowds, faces of dead friends, dead enemies, dead children. They smelled smoke when there was no fire. They jumped at loud noises. They couldn't sit with their backs to doors. Their marriages fell apart. The wives they'd written to every week didn't recognize the men who came home. The laughter was gone, the lightness. These men were quiet, distant, angry. They drank too much. Some hit. Some disappeared for days. Some ate dinner with their families and said nothing, staring at the wall, somewhere else entirely. The divorce rate among Vietnam veterans was twice the national average. The suicide rate was higher, and no one called it PTSD. That term wouldn't exist for another decade. In 1969, if you couldn't adjust, if you couldn't cope, if you woke up every night drenched in sweat and terror, you were weak, broken, damaged goods. The VA hospitals were understaffed and underfunded. The waiting lists were months long. The treatment was primitive. Sedatives, group therapy sessions run by doctors who'd never been to war, advice to move on and put it behind you. Some Marines found help. Most didn't. They self-medicated. Alcohol, drugs. Heroin was cheap and available. Many had started using it in Vietnam, where it was everywhere. Back home, it was the only thing that quieted the noise. Others found solace in work. They threw themselves into jobs, into routines, into anything that kept them busy enough not to think. And some found each other. In VFW halls and American Legion posts, in dive bars on the edges of towns, Vietnam veterans gathered. They didn't talk much. Didn't need to. They just sat together, drank together, existed together in a silence that civilians couldn't understand. Because the only people who understood were the ones who'd been there. The ones who knew what it meant to walk point in Quang Tri province. To hear incoming mortars at Firebase Khe Sanh. To pull a friend's body from a rice paddy. To come home and be told it was all for nothing. There were no parades for Vietnam veterans, no monuments, no national day of recognition. They were expected to disappear, to assimilate, to pretend the war had never touched them, and for the most part they did. They became mechanics and truckers and factory workers. They raised families, paid mortgages, mowed lawns, coached Little League, lived ordinary lives, but inside they carried Vietnam. Every day, every hour. The smell of diesel fuel brought them back to the airfield at Da Nang. The sound of fireworks brought them back to firefights. The sight of a helicopter brought them back to medevac flights with blood on the floor. They carried the faces of the men they'd lost, spoke their names silently on anniversaries, birthdays, holidays. They carried the guilt of survival. Why did I make it when they didn't? They carried the weight of a war the country wanted to forget, and they carried it alone. For years, Vietnam veterans were invisible. The country moved on. Watergate, the oil crisis, disco, Ronald Reagan, the 80s boom, the Cold War's end. America had new concerns, new wars, new heroes. Vietnam was a scar the nation didn't want to look at, but the veterans couldn't move on. The war stayed with them, in their sleep, in their relationships, in the way they startled at sudden sounds or couldn't stand in crowds or kept their backs to walls. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association finally gave it a name: post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD. Not weakness, not moral failing. A wound, an invisible wound, but a wound nonetheless. It was a start, but recognition didn't mean treatment, didn't mean understanding, didn't mean jobs or health care or the support the veterans needed. The VA system was overwhelmed, understaffed, underfunded. Veterans waited months for appointments, years for disability claims. Many gave up. The statistics were devastating. Vietnam veterans were dying by suicide at a rate of 20 per day, more than had died in combat. Homelessness was epidemic. By the mid-80s, nearly 1/3 of America's homeless population were Vietnam veterans. Men who'd served their country, who'd been trained to kill and survive, were sleeping under bridges and in shelters, unable to hold jobs, unable to integrate, unable to escape the war that had ended a decade before. Addiction ravaged the community: alcohol, heroin, prescription pills, anything to numb the memories, quiet the nightmares, silence the ghosts. Families fractured. Children grew up with fathers who were physically present but emotionally absent. Wives became widows to men who were still alive but lost. And through it all, the country remained largely silent. Until 1982. On November 13, 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. It was controversial from the start. The design, a black granite wall inscribed with the names of the 58,000 Americans killed in Vietnam, was called a black gash of shame by critics. Some wanted a traditional monument, statues, flags, something heroic. But Maya Lin's design was different. Quiet. Reflective. A wound in the earth. And when the veterans saw it, they wept. Because finally, their sacrifice was acknowledged. The wall, as it came to be known, became sacred ground. Veterans traveled from across the country to stand before it, to trace the names of friends with their fingers, to leave flowers and letters and dog tags and photographs. The wall didn't judge, didn't ask if the war was right or wrong. It simply remembered. And in remembering, it gave the veterans something they'd been denied for 15 years: recognition. But recognition wasn't reconciliation. The culture wars of the 80s and 90s reopened old wounds. When the Gulf War began in 1991, the country rallied behind the troops in a way it never had for Vietnam. Yellow ribbons, parades, support our troops, bumper stickers. It was a conscious overcorrection, an attempt to separate the war from the warrior. For Vietnam veterans, it was bittersweet. They were glad the troops were being honored, but it stung. Where were the ribbons for us? Where were the parades? Some found healing in service organizations: Vietnam Veterans of America, Rolling Thunder, groups that advocated for benefits, for health care, for the recognition and respect the veterans had been denied. Others found healing in each other: reunions, annual gatherings, Phone calls that lasted hours as old friends relived missions, remembered the dead, tried to make sense of what they'd been through. And slowly, very slowly, some found ways to talk about it. Books began to appear. Memoirs, oral histories, Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, Philip Caputo's A Rumor of War, Michael Hare's Dispatches. These weren't glorifications. They were honest reckonings, raw, painful, true. Films followed. Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, Born on the 4th of July. Hollywood, which had avoided Vietnam for years, finally confronted it, not as propaganda but as tragedy. The culture shifted, slowly. By the 90s, the narrative around Vietnam veterans began to change. They were no longer villains or victims. They were men who'd served in impossible circumstances, who'd done their duty, who'd been failed by their leaders and their country, but had remained loyal to each other. Apologies came late, too late for many. In 2000, President Bill Clinton spoke at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and said, "We were wrong. We were wrong to blame you." It was something, but words couldn't undo decades of neglect. The veterans were aging now, gray-haired, grandfathers. Their bodies bore the scars, shrapnel wounds, Agent Orange cancers, joints destroyed by carrying 100-pound packs through jungles, and the war still haunted them. In quiet moments, sitting on a porch at dusk, lying awake at 3 a.m., and standing alone in a crowded room, they were back there. In the jungle, in the heat, in the fear, because some wounds never heal. But the veterans endured, because that's what Marines do. They endured. So what is the truth about Vietnam that only Marines understand? It's not a single truth. It's not something you can write on a bumper sticker or reduce to a slogan. It's layered, complex, contradictory. But if you ask a Marine who was there, really ask and give them time to think and promise not to judge, they might tell you this. The truth is they went because they were asked, not because they were warmongers or killers or imperialists. Not because they believed in domino theory or Cold War politics. They went because their country called, because it was their duty, because their fathers had gone to war when asked, and their grandfathers before them, and it was simply what you did. They didn't choose the war chose them. The truth is they did their jobs. They patrolled, they fought, they followed orders. They adapted to an impossible situation and made the best decisions they could with the information they had. Were mistakes made? Yes. Atrocities? Yes. War is atrocity. War strips away civilization and reveals what's underneath. And what's underneath is often ugly. But the Marines didn't start the war. They didn't design the strategy. They didn't lie to Congress or manipulate intelligence or send themselves to Vietnam. They were tools, instruments, and when the mission failed, they were blamed for it. The truth is, the failure wasn't theirs. The Marines didn't lose Vietnam. The politicians lost Vietnam. The generals lost Vietnam. The American public lost Vietnam when it stopped believing the war was worth fighting. You can't win a war when half the country opposes it. You can't win a war when the strategy changes every 6 months. You can't win a war when the enemy is willing to die for their cause and your allies aren't willing to fight for theirs. The Marines won nearly every battle they fought. They held every position they were ordered to hold. They never broke, never retreated, never surrendered. But wars aren't won by soldiers alone. They're won by nations. And America, as a nation, gave up. The truth is, brotherhood was all that mattered. In the end, the Marines didn't fight for democracy or freedom or containment theory. They fought for the man next to them, for their fire team, their squad, their brothers. That bond, forged in fear and exhaustion and blood, was the only thing that made sense, the only thing that lasted. Long after the war ended, long after the protests stopped, long after the politicians moved on to other crises, the brotherhood remained. Even now, 50 years later, and when two Marines who served in Vietnam meet for the first time, there's recognition and understanding. They don't need to exchange stories or compare units. They just know they were there. And that's enough. The truth is, The war never ended for them. They came home. They built lives. They raised families. They succeeded. But Vietnam stayed with them. In their nightmares. In the way they reacted to stress. In the things they couldn't talk about. In the memories they couldn't escape. They carried it every day. Some carried it quietly. Some carried it with addiction or anger or isolation. Some didn't carry it long enough. They ended their lives because the weight was too much. But most endured. They survived the war and they survived the aftermath. They lived full lives despite the wounds, visible and invisible. And they did it without recognition, without gratitude, without the country's support. They did it because they were Marines, and Marines endure. The truth is they deserved better. They deserved a strategy that made sense. They deserved leadership that didn't waste their lives. They deserved a country that stood behind them when they came home. They deserved parades and support and the simple acknowledgement that they'd done what was asked of them. No more and no less. They didn't get it. Not for decades. And for many it came too late. But the truth endures. And the truth is simple. The Marines who fought in Vietnam were not villains. They were not victims. They were Americans who served their country in the worst circumstances imaginable. They fought with courage and discipline and loyalty. They suffered and bled and died for each other. And when they came home, they carried the weight alone. That's the truth. The truth that only Marines understand. Across the years, we remember. We remember because someone has to. We remember because forgetting dishonors their sacrifice. We remember because the truth, however painful, however complicated, matters. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe to this channel. And most importantly, thank a veteran, not for the war, but for the service, for the sacrifice, for the burden they carried so the rest of us didn't have to. Because some debts can never be repaid, but they can be remembered.